The graveyard was never silent. Not really. Even in the dead of night, the wind hissed through the cracks in the old stone crosses, and the branches of the weeping willows scraped against each other like bony fingers. But tonight the silence was different, thick, suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Elias Cray, the gravedigger of Black Hollow for 23 years, felt at the moment he pushed open the rusted iron gate. His lantern swung in his hand, casting long, trembling shadows over the rows of tilted headstones. He wasn't a superstitious man. He'd buried too many bodies to fear ghosts. But something was wrong. He'd come back because he'd forgotten. His spade earlier, left leaning against the oak tree near the old family plots. The tool was expensive, and the town council wouldn't replace it if it vanished. As he trudged through the damp grass, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, he noticed the smell, first not the usual damp rot of wet soil, but something sharper, metallic, blood. His pulse quickened. Animals, maybe. A fox or a stray dog had gotten into a fight. But then he saw the disturbed earth, freshly dug. Not by him, it was the Paxton grave, the one he'd filled just yesterday for old Miss Eleanor Paxton, the schoolteacher. The soil was heaped unevenly to the side, and the flowers laid on top had been tossed away, petals crushed. Elias's throat tightened. Grave robbers? But no one robbed graves in Black Hollow. There was nothing to steal. He stepped closer, lantern raised, and that's when he heard it, a soft, wet sound, like someone chewing. His stomach turned. He swung the light toward the noise, and there, crouched in the open grave, was a child. A little boy, no older than 6 or 7, his back to Elias. He was wearing a white nightshirt, stained brown with dirt, and his small hands were busy digging into the loose soil. No, not digging, pulling. The boy yanked hard, and with a sickening tear, something came free from the earth. A strip of cloth, Miss Paxton's burial shroud. Elias's breath caught. The boy brought the cloth to his face, sniffed it, then stuffed it into his mouth. Chewing, Elias's legs locked. He should run, he should scream. But before he could move, the boy's head snapped toward him. Not turn-snapped, like a puppet. Yanked by its strings, his face was pale, his eyes black pits in the lantern light, and his lips were smeared with something dark and glistening. Not dirt, blood. The boy smiled. She tastes like secrets, he whispered. Then the earth beneath Elias's feet trembled, and from the grave a hand shot up, skeletal, fleshless. Fingers curling like a spider's legs. It grabbed the boy's ankle. The child didn't struggle, just kept smiling at Elias as the hand dragged him down into the grave, until the dirt swallowed him whole. The silence returned. The grave was empty again. No boy, no hand. Just loose soil. Elias ran. Elias didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face, those hollow black eyes, that smile smeared with blood. He sat at his kitchen table, hands shaking around a cup of coffee gone cold, and tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the damp air playing tricks on his mind. But he couldn't unsee the way the boy had been eating the shroud. Couldn't. Unhear those words, she tastes like secrets. And worst of all, he couldn't forget the skeletal hand that had dragged the child back into the grave. By sunrise, his nerves were frayed, but he forced himself to return to the cemetery. He had to know if the grave was still disturbed. There was any trace of what he'd seen. The morning fog clung to the ground as he walked through the iron gates, spade gripped tight in his hand like a weapon. The Paxton plot looked undisturbed, freshly packed earth, the flowers neatly rearranged, as if nothing had happened. But Elias knew better. He knelt, running his fingers over the soil, and felt it. A faint, unnatural warmth, like the ground, was breathing. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding. That's when he noticed the marks. Tiny, child-sized handprints pressed into the dirt around the edges of the grave, as if someone had crawled out and then been dragged back in. His throat went dry. He needed to tell someone. But who? The sheriff would laugh at him, the priest would call it madness. And then there was the other thought, the one that slithered into his mind like a snake. What if the boy comes back? He was still crouched there when a voice cut through the silence. Elias. He nearly shouted, spinning around to see Father Alden, the town's aging priest, standing behind him, his black robes blending into the mist. The man's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. But there was no humor in his voice, only something heavier, something like fear. Elias opened his mouth, unsure what to say, but Father Alden spoke first, his voice low. "It started again, hasn't it?" Elias froze. The priest's gaze flicked to the grave, then back to him. The digging, the child. A cold knot tightened in Elias's stomach. He knows. Before Elias could respond, Father Alden grabbed his arm, fingers digging in like claws. "Listen to me. You didn't see anything. You can't have seen anything. Or it'll take you too." Then, just as suddenly, the priest released him, stepping back, his face smoothing into a calm mask. "Bless you, Elias," he said loudly, as if for anyone listening. Then, under his breath, "Stay away from the old graves, or you'll end up in one." Elias watched him walk away, his mind racing. It started again. That meant it had happened. Before, he thought of the boy's rotting nightshirt, the way he'd looked like something from another time, and then he thought of the stories, the old whispered tales about Black Hollow's past, about the children who went missing decades ago, their bodies never found. The town had called it a fever, a tragedy. But Elias was beginning to think it was something worse. Something buried. That evening, he went to the town's archives, a dusty room beneath the courthouse filled with crumbling ledgers and yellowed newspapers. He didn't know what he was looking for until he found it. A single sentence in a ledger from 1893, payment for silence £5 to the gravedigger. The name beside it made his blood run cold. Silas Cray, his great-grandfather. The ledger trembled in Elias's hands as he stared at his great-grandfather's name, the ink faded but unmistakable. Payment for silence? What had Silas known? What had he done? The dates matched the worst years of Black Hollow's history. So-called fading years, when children vanished from their beds. When the town's crops inexplicably flourished even as its people withered with grief. The official records called it a fever, a string of tragic disappearances. But the truth was buried deeper, tucked between the lines of old newspapers that spoke of unholy bargains and whispers in the earth. Elias dug further, his fingers blackening with dust, until he found a brittle, water-stained page torn from a diary. The handwriting was frantic, the letters slanting as if the writer had been in a hurry or in fear. "They say the ground is hungry. They say it must be fed. The sons of the soil gather at midnight, and the chosen child is given to the oldest grave. The next morning, the blight is gone from the fields. I cannot stay silent anymore, but if I speak, will I be next?" The entry was unsigned, but Elias didn't need a name to understand. The town had sacrificed children, and his own blood had helped hide it. He left the archives with a gnawing dread, the weight of the past pressing down on him like a tombstone. The streets of Black Hollow were quiet, the windows dark. But he felt eyes on him, whether from behind curtains or from something else. He couldn't tell. He needed to see the oldest part of the cemetery, where the crumbling headstones bore names long forgotten. If the diary was right, that was where the feeding had happened. The iron gate to the old section was rusted shut, its chains thick. With decades of neglect, but Elias wrenched it open, the metal screeching in protest. The air here was colder, thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something sweetly rotten. His lantern flickered as he moved between the graves, his shadow twisting grotesquely against the moss-covered stones. Then he saw it, a plot unlike the others. No headstone, just a sunken patch of earth, the grass around it blackened and dead. And at its center a hole. Not freshly dug, but old, its edges smooth, as if worn by countless hands or countless climbs. In and out, Elias's breath came in short, sharp gasps. This was the place. He could feel it. The diary's words echoed in his mind. The chosen child is given to the oldest grave. Knelt, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, and pressed his palm to the soil. It was warm, alive, and then a sound. Giggle, high and thin, like a child's laughter muffled by layers of earth. His blood turned to ice. He scrambled back, but not fast enough. A small, dirt-caked hand shot out of the hole, its fingers curling around his wrist. The grip was impossibly strong. Elias yanked back, panic surging through him, but the hand held fast, and now another emerged. Then another, dozens of skeletal fingers digging into the ground as something began to pull itself up. The giggling grew louder, merging into a chorus. Of voices, children's voices chanting in unison. You found us, now stay with us. The earth around the hole cracked, splitting open like a wound, and Elias caught a glimpse of what lay beneath pale faces, hollow eyes, tiny bodies tangled together in a mass of rotting cloth and bone. The hungry dead. The fed, with a final, desperate wrench, Elias tore free, stumbling back as the hands clawed at the air, the laughter rising to a shriek. He ran, his lungs burning, not stopping until he was back in the newer section of the cemetery, where the graves were orderly and the dead stayed buried. But as he bent over, gasping for breath, a single realization cut through his terror. The hole hadn't been meant for him. It had been meant for them. The children. And if they were climbing out now, it meant the bargain was breaking. It meant the ground was hungry again. The church bells were ringing when Elias stumbled into town, his clothes caked with mud, his face pale as the moon that hung low over Black Hollow. People turned to stare as he passed, their whispers sharp as knives. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop, not until he reached the weathered door of the only person who might believe him, Martha Hargrove. The town's oldest living soul, a woman whose memory stretched back further than the oldest headstone in the cemetery. Her cottage smelled of dried herbs and candle wax, the air thick with the weight of years. And when she opened the door, her milky eyes fixed on him with a knowing. "Dread, you've seen them," she said. Not a question, but a statement, her voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. She ushered him inside before he could answer, bolting the door behind them. And Elias collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold the cup of bitter tea she pressed into them. Martha listened in silence as he spilled. Everything: the boy in the grave, the ledger, the hole in the oldest section of the cemetery, the hands that had tried to drag him down. When he finished, she let out a long, shuddering breath and crossed herself, her fingers trembling. "The sons of the soil," she whispered. "I'd hoped they'd taken their secrets to the grave." She moved to the hearth, where a fire crackled low, and pulled a rusted iron box from a hidden niche in the stones. Inside lay a single yellowed page, its edges brittle with age. "My grandfather was the town clerk," she said, unfolding it carefully. "He wrote this the night before they found him dead in his bed, his mouth stuffed with soil." Elias leaned closer, his stomach churning as he read the spidery script. "The pact is renewed with blood and bone. The firstborn of the guilty must be given, or the earth will take its due." Elias's blood ran cold. The firstborn of the guilty. His mind raced. His great-grandfather had been part of this. Did that make him guilty? Did that mean... Martha seemed to read his thoughts. "Not you," she said sharply. "The firstborn of the original families, the ones who started it." She listed names, each one a dagger to Elias's chest. The mayor's lineage, the sheriff's father Alden's. And then, her voice dropping to a whisper, "The children you saw? They weren't just taken, they were chosen. The town picked the unwanted, the orphaned, the ones no one would fight for. And now the earth is hungry again because the pact's been broken. Someone refused to pay." A crash outside made them both jump. Elias whirled toward the window, his heart hammering. But the street was empty, except for a single, small footprint in the mud beneath the sill. Fresh. The giggling started then. Faint at first, then swelling, coming from every direction. Once, as if the air itself was laughing.
House.
Martha's face went ashen.
House.
"They're here," she breathed. The fire in the hearth guttered, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Ilias's breath fogged in the sudden cold as the giggling morphed into words, whispered by a dozen voices at once. We know. Where the firstborn sleeps? Martha grabbed his arm, her nails biting into his flesh. You have to stop them, she hissed, before they take another child, before the earth wakes up hungry. But Elias could only stare at the window, where a small, pale face had appeared in the glass, a boy, with black eyes and a smile, too wide for his face. The same boy from the grave. He pressed a single finger to the glass, leaving a smudge of dirt behind, then mouthed two words, too late. The scream tore through the night like a knife, raw and primal, the sound of a mother's terror. Elias knew before he ran out the door whose voice it was. The whole town knew the Wellen baby had been born just a week ago. The first child born to the mayor's bloodline in a generation. He sprinted toward the sound, his boots slipping on the wet cobblestones, the cold air burning his lungs. But even before he reached the grand house at the end of the lane, he knew he was too late. The front door hung open, swaying on its hinges, and inside, the scene was one of pure nightmare. Mrs. Wellen knelt on the floor of the nursery, her nightgown drenched in sweat, her arms clutching an empty blanket to her chest, her screams dissolving into choked, wordless sobs. The cradle beside her was pristine, untouched, the lace-trimmed sheets still neatly tucked, but the window above it was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze like beckoning hands. Elias didn't need to ask what had happened. The tiny footprints in the spilled talcum powder told the story. Small, bare feet, pacing in a circle around the cradle before stopping at its edge, and then nothing. No steps leading away, just empty space where the child had been lifted out. The sheriff arrived moments later, his face grim. But when Elias grabbed his arm and hissed, "It's the pack, they've taken the firstborn," the man's expression hardened into something dangerous. "Shut your damn mouth, Cray," he snarled. Low enough that the grieving mother couldn't hear. "Start spreading that filth, and I'll toss you in a cell until you rot." Elias saw the flicker of fear in the man's eyes, the way his fingers twitched toward the revolver at his hip, as if he expected the shadows themselves to lunge. By dawn, the town was in chaos. The mayor's men swept through the streets, barking orders, blaming vagrants, gypsies, anything but the truth. But Elias knew better. He'd seen the boy at the window. He'd heard the voices in Martha's cottage. And now, as he stood at the edge of the oldest part of the cemetery, he could feel the earth itself breathing beneath his feet, slow and steady, like a beast stirring from slumber. The hole was wider now, its edges crumbling inward as if something large had forced its way out. And the dirt god, the dirt tit, wasn't just warm anymore. It pulsed, like a heartbeat. Martha found him there, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill, her face lined with exhaustion. "They'll come for you next," she said quietly. "You know too much." Elias didn't answer.
Alice.
His gaze was fixed on the hole, where something gleamed in the weak sunlight, a tiny silver rattle. Half buried in the soil, the Wellen crest was engraved on its handle. Martha followed his stare and let out a soft, broken sound. "It's already begun," she whispered, "the feeding." A gust of wind howled through the graveyard, carrying with it the faint, far-off sound of a baby's cry. Elias's head snapped up. The sound wasn't coming from the town. It was coming from below, from the hole. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and reached into the darkness, his fingers brushing something cold and smaller, tiny clutching hand. Alive. The baby was alive down there. He lunged forward, but Martha yanked him back with surprising strength. "No," she gasped. "Don't you understand? They're luring you in." Elias struggled against her, desperation clawing at his chest. But then the earth beneath them moved, the soil rippling like water, and from the depths of the hole, a dozen skeletal arms erupted, their fingers grasping, their bones clicking together in a macabre rhythm. The baby's cries turned to giggles high, shrill, and utterly inhuman. Martha dragged Elias to his feet, her voice a whip-crack of command. "Run, now."
Oh.
They fled just as the first of the figures pulled itself free of the earth, a child. Or, what had once been a child, its flesh sagging from its bones like wet paper, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light. It tilted its head, watching them go, and then it smiled. Behind it, more shapes stirred in the darkness, rising, hungry. The church bell began to toll on its own that evening, a deep, sonorous knell that shuddered through the bones of the town, though no hand touched the rope. Elias stood at the edge of the square, watching as windows lit up one by one. Faces pressed to the glass pale, frightened, all pretending they didn't know what was coming. Martha had locked herself in her cottage with iron across the door, and shotgun shells filled with salt, but Elias couldn't hide.
Not now.
The air smelled like wet soil and something older, something that curled in the back of his throat like the memory of a scream. He knew where he had to go. The old well at the center of town, the one they'd boarded up after the Miller boy fell in a century ago, the place where the first sacrifice had supposedly been made. The well's stones were slick with moss. The wood covering it split down the middle as though something had punched up from below. Elias pried the broken planks aside, his muscles straining, and the darkness that greeted him wasn't empty. It breathed. A damp, rotting warmth rushed up to meet him, carrying with it the sound of whispers, not one voice, but dozens, layered over each other like the buzzing of flies. He held his lantern over the edge, the flame guttering wildly, and the light caught on something below, not water. Hands, small, skeletal, pressed palm up against the well's interior, as if waiting for an offering. Elias recoiled, but before he could step back, a voice spoke from directly behind him, so close he felt the words brush his ear. "You should have let us keep the baby." He spun, lantern swinging, and there stood the boy from the grave, his nightshirt now black with grave dirt, his lips peeled back in a grin that showed too many teeth. Behind him, the shadows between the houses thickened, resolving into shapes children, some half-frotted, some eerily perfect, all watching him with those same hollow eyes. The boy tilted his head. They lied, you know. The pact was never just firstborns. That was only the beginning. He took a step forward, and the earth itself seemed to shudder beneath his bare feet. The ground is hungry, Elias, and tonight it feasts. A scream ripped through the night from somewhere near the cemetery, then another from the direction of the mayor's house. The town was waking to horror doors, splintering, windows shattering, the dead children pouring in like a flood. The boy laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and Elias understood with terrible clarity. This wasn't just revenge. It was a harvest. The earth was taking back what the town had sworn to give. He lunged for the boy, desperation overriding fear, but his hands passed through empty air. The child's form dissolved into mist, his laughter echoing as the shadows surged forward. Elias ran not toward the chaos, but to the one place he knew still held answers: the church. Father Alden would be there, and he would talk, or Elias would make him. The heavy oak doors were barred from inside. Elias kicked them once, twice, the wood shuddering, and on the third blow they flew open, not from his force, but because Father Alden stood there. A rusted iron cross in one hand, his face a mask of resigned terror. "I tried to warn you," he whispered. Behind him the altar was strewn with old ledgers, their pages open to lists of names, dates, payments, but Elias's attention locked on the thing at the priest's feet. Small, open coffin, its interior lined with black silk. And inside, nestled in the fabric, like a grotesque parody of a child's bed, lay a single, tiny skeleton. Its skull was cracked down the middle, its fingers curled around a yellowed scrap of paper. Father Alden's voice broke. "We thought, if we kept one of them close, the rest would stay buried. We were wrong." Outside, the screaming grew louder, closer. Something heavy slammed against the church walls, sending dust shaking from the rafters. Elias reached into the coffin and lifted the scrap of paper. The writing was faded, but unmistakable. The last sacrifice must be willing, or the hunger never ends. The church doors exploded inward before Elias could speak, splinters of wood flying like shrapnel as the horde of dead children poured through the shattered entrance. Their skeletal fingers scraping against the stone floor, their hollow eyes fixed on the priest with a hunger that went beyond revenge. Father Alden stumbled back, the iron cross slipping from his grasp as the first of them reached him, a girl in a tattered communion dress, her fleshless arms wrapping around his legs like vines, her jaw unhinging with a wet crack as she whispered, "You promised we'd be remembered." The priest's scream was cut short as the others swarmed him, dragging him down into a writhing mass of tiny bodies. The sound of tearing cloth and snapping bones drowned out by their giggling, a sound so horribly alive it made Ilias's stomach heave. He backed toward the altar, the scrap of paper still clutched in his hand, the words burning into his mind. The last sacrifice must be willing. The boy from the grave stood apart from the others, watching Elias with that same unnerving smile. Behind him, the shadows in the doorway deepened, coagulating into something larger, shapeless, shifting mass that pulsed in time with the earth's unnatural heartbeat. The ground itself was waking. The boy tilted his head. You understand now, don't you? They didn't just bury us, they bound us, and only a Cray can undo it. Ilias's breath hitched. His great-grandfather had been the last gravedigger too. Bury a child alive. His blood had sealed the pact. And now the earth demanded balance. A life for a life. Cray for the children. The boy extended a hand, his fingers black with grave soil. You don't have to die, he murmured. Just say yes. For a heartbeat, Elias hesitated. He could run. He could let the town burn. But then the ground beneath him trembled, and from the open coffin at his feet, the tiny skeleton's skull turned to face him, its empty sockets filling with a slow, creeping darkness. The choice was already made. Elias took the boy's hand, the moment their fingers touched. The church dissolved around him, the walls crumbling into dirt, the pews rotting into roots, the very air thickening with the scent of turned earth and old blood. He was standing in the cemetery again, but not as it had been. Moonlight bathed the rows of fresh graves. And at the center stood a group of men in old-fashioned coats, their faces obscured by hoods. One held a squirming bundle wrapped in burlap. A child's muffled cries pierced the night, and at the edge of the scene, watching with a shovel in his hands, stood Silas Cray. Ilias's throat closed. He tried to shout, to stop what was coming, but his voice was gone, his body insubstantial as mist. He could only watch as his great-grandfather stepped forward. As the men lowered the child into the waiting grave, as the first shovelful of dirt hit the burlap with a dull thud, the vision shattered. Elias gasped, collapsing to his knees in the present-day cemetery, the boy still gripping his hand. Around them, the dead children had gone still, their hollow eyes fixed on him, waiting. The boy squeezed his fingers. This is where it began, he whispered, and where it ends. He pointed to the oldest grave, the sunken, blackened patch of earth. The hole at its center yawned open like a mouth. Elias knew what he had to do. He walked to the edge of the hole, the boy trailing behind him like a shadow. Below, the darkness stirred, the whispers rising to a crescendo. The earth was hungry, but not for him, not yet. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the ledger. Page he'd taken from the archives, the one with his great-grandfather's name. The proof of the town's sin. He held it over the hole. You want the truth? He said, his voice raw. Here it is. He let the page fall. The moment it touched the darkness, the ground erupted. Skeletal hands shot up, snatching the paper, dragging it down. And as they did, the children around him let out a collective sigh, sound of release. The boy's grip on Ilias's hand loosened. Thank you, he murmured, his form already fading, his voice blending with the others. Now we can sleep. One by one, the children sank back into the earth, their bodies dissolving into soil, their whispers fading to silence. The hole sealed itself, the ground knitting together like a healing wound. And as the first light of dawn broke over the cemetery, Elias realized the warmth beneath his feet was gone. The earth was still in town. The survivors would tell stories of a night of madness, of fever dreams, and unexplained horrors. They'd rebuild. They'd forget. But Elias would remember. He knelt, pressing his palm to the freshly packed soil where the hole had been, and whispered the names from the ledger. Everyone, the wind, carried them away. And in the quiet that followed, the graveyard was finally, truly silent.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.